Mr. President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Mr. President. 2 weeks ago, I left for Greece with a Senate delegation that included Dick Durbin from Illinois, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, and Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. And in my capacity as lead Democrat on the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee on Europe and Regional Security Cooperation, I was honored to head our delegation. We were there to witness firsthand the plight of refugees arriving by sea on the island of Lesbos. In Greece and later in Germany, we received in-depth briefings on the refugee crisis and Europe's response to it. In Kyiv, in the Ukraine, we conferred with the Ukrainian Prime Minister and President about their country's struggle to create a stable democracy in the face of ongoing Russian aggression. Nearly 250,000 Syrians have been killed during the current conflict in the Middle East. An estimated 8 million Syrians have been displaced internally, and another 4 million have left the country. They are fleeing hunger, unspeakable violence, and a land that no longer offers any hope for their children. They have endured barrel bombs, chemical attacks, indiscriminate shelling, the barbarity of ISIS, and now a military offensive sponsored by Russia and Iran. To reach Europe, these refugees have been preyed upon by traffickers and other criminals, some selling refugee children for sex, for slavery, or for organs. The refugees have risked drowning at sea and suffocation in locked vans, and they will soon confront the freezing temperatures and snows of winter. While we were traveling, we heard accounts from the refugees of paying smugglers thousands of dollars to get on small boats with motors that barely work, boats built for a few, but loaded with 40 to 50 refugees. And I use the term boats loosely. What I'm talking about is rubber rafts that were built to hold maybe 10 to 15 people that were loaded with 40 to 50 refugees. The Greek Coast Guard told us that refugees pay exorbitant prices for life preservers that are more like children's inflatables that you see in swimming pools. And when refugees set off from Turkey to cross the Aegean to Lesbos, they're instructed by the smugglers to puncture their raft with a knife if they encounter the Greek Coast Guard, so that the Greeks will be forced to rescue them. I was profoundly moved by my conversations with refugees from Syria and other conflict zones in the Middle East. It's one thing to hear about millions of Syrian refugees fleeing the war. It is something else entirely to actually meet and talk with individual refugees, including children who have been separated from their parents. I was struck by the fact that many of these refugees have endured extreme hardship for weeks, if not years, and their future is filled with extreme uncertainty. Yet so many of them were filled with optimism and hope. In Athens, we met a 6-year-old Afghan boy who had made the trip to Greece with his 13-year-old cousin. This boy proudly gave us all sticks of gum. In Germany, we met young men from Syria, a former English teacher, a PhD student, and an engineer. One young man looked ahead to a brighter future and said he wanted to be president of Syria. These refugees were weary, they were anxious, but they were also deeply grateful and hopeful about their future lives in a safe, secure Europe. Altogether, we met and talked with a couple dozen refugees. They are men, women, children no different from loved ones in our own families and citizens in our own communities. They aspire to the very same things, including a decent life for their children. They told us about the desperation and despair they left behind in Syria, Iraq, and other conflict areas. Multiply these desperate stories by countless thousands of refugees, up to 10,000 entering Europe daily, more than 1 million so far this year, and it adds up to a humanitarian crisis of staggering dimensions. Now, to be sure, Europe is being challenged, but this crisis also challenges the United States and the world. At critical moments in history, the international community has faced similar challenges. Jews seeking refuge from persecution and later genocide in Nazi Germany, famine killing millions in Biafra in the late 1960s, the genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Darfur, and Bosnia. And faced with these crises, the world confronted a stark choice: to turn away or to engage. Well, Mr. President, the United States cannot turn away from the refugee crisis unfolding in the Middle East and Europe. On Lesbos last week, we talked with Greeks who operate small businesses that depend on tourism, which has dried up because of the crisis. They said that the refugees must be their first priority, that Greeks must help people who are in need. In Athens, we visited a facility for refugee children run by a group called Praxis. Praxis workers told us about Afghan children being sold in Europe as sex slaves for as much as $10,000. Praxis and scores of similar organizations are doing everything possible with very limited means to meet the refugees' desperate needs. In Germany, we met with officials at the Finance Ministry and the Chancery, as well as people in and out of government who are rising to the challenge of the refugee crisis. Chancellor Angela Merkel has demonstrated extraordinary moral leadership in addressing this crisis. Millions of ordinary German citizens, indeed people all across Europe, have mobilized to meet the needs of the refugees. However, it was clear to me and to other senators in our delegation that these noble efforts are not enough. The refugee crisis is too big. The scale of human suffering and need is overwhelming. President Obama has offered to take in 10,000 refugees over the next year. But Germany is taking in as many as 10,000 refugees in a single day after day, week after week, with no end in sight. My state of New Hampshire has been welcoming to refugees fleeing conflict, as have other states. I think people are eager to do more across this country. Turkey needs to secure its borders, and it needs to crack down on smugglers and criminal gangs exploiting and trafficking in refugees. Frontline countries, including Greece and Italy, need more resources to help process and register refugees. And in fact, the same is true of Turkey, of Jordan, and Lebanon, who have taken in millions of refugees. As I said, Germany has earned our admiration for its leadership, offering to take in as many as 1 million refugees this year. But for all its resources, Germany can't do this alone. It's already reaching a point where its communities can't keep up with the influx. We are confronting the greatest humanitarian crisis of our time. Europe is responding. The European Union will use the coming winter months, when the flow of refugees will slow, to come up with a more effective plan to share the burden and address this challenge. However, European nations, Turkey, Jordan, and other frontline states, Lebanon, can't meet this challenge alone. The international community must give more generous support to humanitarian efforts by the World Food Program and others. And by all means, the United States, as leader of the Atlantic Alliance, must play a more robust role in addressing the refugee crisis. I'm heartened by the bipartisan bill that's sponsored by Senator Graham of South Carolina and Leahy of Vermont, which would provide $1 billion in assistance to meeting the needs of refugees. The Obama administration has proposed taking in 10,000 Syrian refugees over the next year. That's a start, but it's not enough given the scale of this crisis. We have the resources to safely vet and process more refugees for asylum in the United States, even as we need to do so more efficiently. As Senator Graham said recently, I don't see how you can lead the free world and turn your back on people who are seeking it. To turn away families fleeing violence, says Senator Graham, is to, and I quote, take the Statue of Liberty and tear it down because we don't mean it anymore, end quote. We also need to deal with the root of the problem, the violence in Syria. We must redouble our diplomatic efforts as well as our campaign against the Islamic State in both Syria and Iraq. Unfortunately, there's a new dimension to the chaos and conflict in Syria. In recent weeks, Russia has sent combat planes, heavy armor, and military personnel to support the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Russia is threatening to send thousands of so-called, I say that in quotes, so-called volunteer troops to Syria to fight on the front line. A newly aggressive and reckless Russia is a problem not only in the Middle East, but also in Ukraine, where our Senate delegation visited after leaving Greece. The Ukrainians are struggling to fight corruption and build a stable democracy, but those efforts have been severely undermined by Russian subversion and aggression. President Putin was not content to invade and annex Crimea. He's also sponsored the establishment of Russia-controlled provinces in eastern Ukraine. And this conflict in the east of Ukraine is designed by Russia to destabilize democratic Ukraine and to drain its resources. Now, while in Kyiv, our delegation met with senior government officials, including Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk and President Petro Poroshenko. We were briefed on Russia's efforts on many fronts to destabilize the country. And we were also briefed on Ukraine's efforts to boost its economy and root out corruption in the country's government and institutions. The European Union and the United States are standing by Ukraine, and this solidarity is making a difference. It appears to have moderated Russia's ambitions, at least for now. The countries of Western Europe and the United States have demanded that Russia fully implement the Minsk II agreement to contain the conflict, and we heard some encouraging signs. Elections in the breakaway provinces, elections that might have led to succession, have been delayed. Russia is redeploying light armor away from the region. But of course, this is not adequate. Sanctions on Russia must remain in place until President Putin and the rebels he backs fulfill all of their obligations under the Minsk II agreement. I left Ukraine with a strong sense that despite living under an ever-present threat from Russia, this is a nation that continues to stand strong and move forward. It was an honor to personally reaffirm to Ukraine's leadership and citizens that the United States is an ally and partner, and that we strongly support the government's agenda of reform and modernization. Our European allies are confronting an array of challenges unprecedented since the end of the Second World War. Not only the refugee crisis, but also rising threats from Russia, economies that continue to be held back by debt and austerity, and a resurgence of nationalistic and nativist political parties. However, our delegation witnessed firsthand a creative and resourceful Europe that is capable of meeting these challenges. Europe needs and deserves American support and partnership, beginning with a more robust U.S. response to the refugee crisis, which is the greatest humanitarian challenge of our time. I hope we in this chamber and in Congress will rise in response to that challenge to do our part. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk should call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.